If I asked you what was, in your opinion, the worst episode of The Simpsons, what would you say? I'd imagine a fair few of you would pick a character assassination like The Principal and the Pauper, or perhaps you'd choose one of the many guest episodes like Lisa Goes Gaga. You might even go with a more recent pick like E My Sports. I'm here to propose to you that the worst episode of The Simpsons' entire history is one that I'm certain very few of you would have thought of, and that episode is Season 14, Episode 9, The Strong Arms of Ma. Now, this episode rarely, if ever, comes up when people discuss the worst episodes of The Simpsons. Although its critical reception is far from spectacular, its ratings don't stand out amongst other episodes in Season 14, and it is far from the lowest rated in the show's history. It is my goal to draw attention to this mostly forgotten episode and explain my case as to why it is the blackest spot in the show's entire run. So, the episode starts out simple enough, with everyone's favourite action movie star, Rainier Wolfcastle, hosting a garage sale. There are some alright jokes here, and it's a fairly standard opening. What I want to focus on, however, is the very next scene in which Marge must make an emergency stop on her way home to change Maggie's diaper. Unfortunately, as she is exiting the bathroom in a darkened alley, she is held at gunpoint by a mugger who demands her diaper bag, mistaking it for a purse. Upon realizing this, the mugger instead snatches Marge's necklace before running off. Marge then returns to her car and breaks down into a fit of tears.
Mom? Are you okay?
This scene is perhaps the darkest in the show's history. Now, don't get me wrong, I think director Pete Michelle's nails what he's trying to accomplish here. I just don't think that his goals were very appropriate for a show like The Simpsons. There is a genuine sense of terror that we rarely ever see in the show. The danger feels real and the stakes high as both Marge and Maggie are trapped in this alley at night, creating a sense of isolation. The mugger even cocks the hammer of his gun, indicating that he will not hesitate to shoot. There are arguably two jokes within this scene, the mugger's hat and his mistaken identity of the diaper bag. Both do nothing to alleviate the tension, and in the case of the diaper bag, actually increase it, as we see Marge in a state of panic trying to explain the mugger's mistake.
That's not a purse, it's a diaper bag.
What?
It looks like a purse, that's why I bought it, but it's really
Shut up!
When he rips Marge's necklace from her neck, it intensifies the danger yet again as the mugger closes the gap from the mere threat of violence to an actual physical assault. The whole time this altercation takes place, there is a tense musical score which leads into a somber mood as Marge returns to her car and just breaks down into a fit of tears in front of her children. As you can see, I think this scene is done incredibly well, but that doesn't change the fact that it is far too dark for The Simpsons. I've never really been a big fan of scenes where the characters are in a non-outrageous or non-comedic form of danger, and this is especially true when it comes to the threat of guns. This scene is very similar to when Herman held Homer hostage during the Springfield connection, though that still pales in comparison to the danger felt in the mugging. At least in that episode, the threat ends with our characters triumphantly overcoming the danger. I understand that that's not really the goal here, but that's my point. Seeing Marge lose her necklace, a symbol of what the robber has taken from her mental stability, and then having to go back to her car and just fall apart is honestly a really tough thing to watch. Now, obviously I'm fine with characters facing obstacles. Overcoming conflict is one of, if not the most common theme in storytelling. But the execution of said conflict needs to match the tone that is appropriate for the story being told, and in this case, I just think they went far too serious. Now, continuing on with the episode, we see that the mugging has left Marge traumatized and suffering from agoraphobia, a fear of leaving the house. The way they show this fear manifesting is actually really cool, with some great visuals and a small joke to try and alleviate some of the tension. Something I think the mugging would have really benefited from. The next part of the episode revolves around Marge dealing with this trauma, and overall, I actually think it's pretty good, with some really funny gags and a great demonstration on how Marge's experience has affected her.
I'm a robber!
It's just such a shame that said experience was so genuinely serious that you almost feel bad laughing at any of the jokes here. The show actually has an example of how to properly handle trauma in a previous episode, Season 6's Fear of Flying. Once again, we see that Marge is dealing with a phobia caused by a traumatic event, this time a fear of flying. Now, while it's still a realistic fear, it is far less debilitating than an agoraphobia, and the episode makes sure to give us a comedic source, or sources, for this trauma. This alleviates the seriousness of the situation, while still giving Marge a genuine character moment. She handles this trauma in a healthy manner, going to therapy to examine the source of her problems and how they've affected her. The Strong Arms of Ma, however, goes for a well, different approach to recovering from trauma. Marge begins to exercise until she starts to develop muscles, which gives her the confidence to leave the house again. This isn't inherently a bad way for her to overcome her problems. Self-improvement can be a great form of therapy, and if portrayed in a healthy manner, I would have no problem with its use here. Unfortunately, this just isn't the case, as we quickly see this healthy coping mechanism morph into a toxic one. Arguably our first sign of this comes from the scene where she re-encounters her mugger, and this time manages to beat him quite brutally. On its own, this beatdown would actually be quite cathartic, but when placed in the context of the later parts of the episode, it instead feels like foreshadowing of the horrible effects Marge's newfound strength is having on her. Though this could be viewed separately from her future actions, as those were likely intended to be viewed as a result of her steroid addiction. Speaking of which, this is where we get to the part where Marge develops a steroid addiction. Not exactly the kind of plot point I think the show would ever go in if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Marge goes from overcoming her trauma to being addicted to drugs in the span of like 3 minutes. It's a bit of a whiplash. So the steroids cause Marge to become aggressive, which leads into the absolute worst joke The Simpsons has ever made. This is a content warning to those who are sensitive to the topic of sexual assault. I'll keep any specific discussion on this topic contained to this one section of the video. Feel free to jump to the time below to skip it. This section's going to be really difficult to discuss, as it feels so out of place for a Simpsons episode, and it's going to be lighting up every warning in YouTube's automatic detection system. Marge comes to bed and Homer is visibly scared of her. He wants to discuss her steroid addiction, but all she wants to do is snuggle. Homer very clearly does not want to do this, but when he tries to resist, Marge forces herself on top of him and says, "I wasn't asking." We then see Homer in the kitchen the next morning, exhausted from the previous night and walking with a limp. I honestly don't know how to talk about this scene. This has got to be the most significant form of character assassination the show has ever done, even more than Principal Skinner's surprise reveal. Everyone always gets rightfully angry when Homer faces a similar situation with a panda bear, but at least that's a wild animal. This is the character we've been with for 14 seasons, who we've seen has a good moral compass and cares about her family. To have Marge commit such a horrible act upon the one she loves diminishes any positive trait she's ever displayed. This feels like the kind of awful joke Family Guy would do, which is because Family Guy did do the same joke. In the episode Lethal Weapons, Lois learns karate and becomes physically strong. She transforms into an aggressive person and forces herself upon Peter when he rejects her advances. We then see Peter negatively affected the next morning. In fact, these scenes are so similar that I did a little digging and found out that the supervising director of this Family Guy episode is none other than Pete Michels, the director of The Strong Arms of Ma. Now, I really cannot claim to know how much influence Michels has over both episodes, but it is an interesting coincidence at least. I don't want to stay in this part any longer than I must, but this scene takes what is an already awful episode and just plunges it straight down to my least favourite of the whole series. So, by this point in the episode, the whole family fears Marge and is now scared on how her failures and their comments about said failures may set her off. Not sure that I wanted a Simpson episode where Marge has the presence of a domestic abuser, but here it is, I guess. It certainly only takes a single rude comment from Moe for her to threaten to murder him, which is how we end the episode, with a bar brawl where she proceeds to beat every abled body in the bar. Quite brutally, I might add. I'm not saying that is blood, but it definitely looks like blood. Thankfully, Homer gives a half-sincere, half-desperate out of fear speech, which calms her down and they live happily ever after.
Club soda will get that blood out.
I guess it is blood. Overcoming conflict is one of the core elements of almost any story, and The Simpsons is no exception. It's important for these characters to be confronted with bad situations, but the type of conflict, its portrayal, and the process of overcoming it are all very important decisions that in the case of a show like The Simpsons, must be made on an episode-by-episode basis. I believe this episode fails in all three of these areas, something rare for even modern-day Simpsons. I just don't understand what the writers were trying to achieve here. They push Marge through such a difficult journey, and it doesn't really feel like she's come out of it for the better. All I see is a loving mum who has a traumatizing experience and in the process of trying to recover ends up hurting those she loves. I'm not saying that a story like that can't work, but when you've got a 22-minute time slot and a relatively lighthearted tone, it sure seems like it'd be really difficult to make it work. I'm not even sure what the message of the episode is. Be careful not to abuse your coping mechanisms lest they themselves become a new source of problems? I guess that could be it, but that would usually involve an unhealthy coping mechanism. Marge originally was just exercising at a healthy pace, which seems fine to me. Only problem started arising when her friend pushed drugs onto her. Maybe the message is don't do drugs? Yeah, sure, why not? Let's just go with that. Don't do drugs, kids.